My name is Ryan Ellis, and I'm 28 years old. This happened last month, and I still can't explain what I experienced. I'm a freelance photographer specializing in folklore and abandoned places. I've spent years chasing eerie stories for my portfolio and blog, but nothing prepared me for Mathewson State Park. I went there to find the Witch's Trail, a barely known part of the park tied to an old legend. Locals claimed a woman accused of witchcraft in the 1800s was hanged near the trail. They said her spirit still lingered, cursing anyone who dared to walk it. It sounded like the perfect story to document. I arrived at the park on a sunny afternoon, parking my RV in the designated campsite. The area seemed peaceful. Lush greenery, distant bird calls, the occasional sound of rushing water from nearby waterfalls. It was hard to imagine anything sinister about the place. I headed to the visitor center first, hoping to get some background on the trail. That's where I met Janet, a park historian. She was a no-nonsense woman in her early 40s, with a tight bun and sharp eyes that sized me up the moment I walked in. "You're here for the Witch's Trail," she said, not bothering to hide her disapproval. I smiled. "Guilty. I'm a photographer. I want to capture some of the park's folklore." She sighed. "It's just a story, a tragic one, sure, but nothing more. The trail isn't on the map for a reason. It's dangerous, overgrown, rocky, easy to get lost." "I'll be careful," I assured her. "But what's the story?" She hesitated before speaking. The witch, if you can call her that, wasn't a witch at all. She was a healer, lived alone on the outskirts of what used to be a small settlement. When a sickness swept through the area, people accused her of causing it. They hanged her near the trail, and ever since, strange things have been reported there. "Like what?" I asked, leaning forward. Janet gave me a hard look. "People hear whispers, feel like they're being watched. Some say they see her, others get lost. Even seasoned hikers, I'm telling you, don't go looking for it." I thanked her for the warning, but had no intention of taking her advice. I spent the rest of the day scouting the main trails, taking photos of waterfalls and canyon walls. As evening approached, I found a small, unmarked path leading into the woods. The air felt colder here, the trees thicker, their branches weaving a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. "This must be it," I muttered, stepping onto the trail. The ground was uneven, the path barely discernible beneath the overgrowth. I couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were closing in on me, their gnarled branches almost reaching for my shoulders. As I walked, strange symbols began to appear on the trees, carvings of circles, crosses, and jagged lines. They didn't look recent. Moss and lichen had grown over some of them. I stopped to photograph one, but when I turned my camera on, it wouldn't focus. The screen flashed error, and the battery icon suddenly turned red. "That's weird," I muttered. The battery had been fully charged that morning. I replaced it with a spare, but the camera still wouldn't work. The silence was oppressive, no birds, no wind, just the sound of my own breathing. I started to feel like I wasn't alone. Several times I thought I heard footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, there was no one there. I pressed on, determined to find something worth photographing. That's when I met him. The hermit. He emerged from the shadows like he'd been waiting for me. He was a scruffy, wiry man in his 60s, wearing a tattered coat and a hat that looked like it had seen better days. "Looking for the witch, are you?" he asked, his voice gravelly. I froze, caught off guard. "How do you know?" "Only reason someone like you would come this far." He stepped closer, his eyes darting around nervously. "I've seen her, you know. Tall, shadowy, eyes like fire." "You've seen her?" I asked, my curiosity piqued despite the unease he exuded. He nodded. "She doesn't like visitors. You should turn back." I considered his words, but ultimately brushed them off. I wasn't about to leave empty-handed. "Thanks for the warning," I said, stepping past him. "You'll regret it," he called after me. His voice followed me long after I could no longer see him. The deeper I went, the colder it got. The carvings on the trees became more elaborate, almost glowing in the dim light. My chest tightened, and my breath came in shallow gasps. I wasn't sure if it was fear or something else. Then I saw her. She stood in the distance, partially obscured by the trees. Tall and impossibly thin, her long black hair swayed as if caught in a breeze I couldn't feel. Her eyes glowed a dull red, and her head tilted slightly, as though she were studying me. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. Instead, she moved, not walking, but flickering, like an old film reel skipping frames. One moment she was farther away, the next she was closer. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. My flashlight flickered, and when it steadied, she was gone. I should have turned back, but I didn't. Something about the trail pulled me forward, as if I were no longer in control of my own feet. The whispers began then, soft at first, then louder. "Ryan! Ryan!" They came from all directions, as if the trees themselves were speaking my name. My heart pounded as I broke into a run, no longer caring about the trail or the photos. The ground beneath me quaked, and the symbols on the trees began to glow. A deep, guttural voice boomed through the forest. "You dare trespass!" I looked up, and there she was, towering over me. Her shadow stretched across the ground, her eyes burning like embers. "Leave!" she hissed, her voice echoing in my skull. I tried to run, but the ground seemed to shift beneath my feet, pulling me toward her. Desperate, I raised my camera and snapped a photo. The flash lit up the darkness for a split second before the camera shattered in my hands. I don't remember how I got back to the RV. The next thing I knew, I was slamming the door shut, my chest heaving. The RV was deathly quiet, but I felt her presence. When I glanced in the rearview mirror, her face stared back at me, her eyes glowing with malice. I didn't sleep that night. As soon as the sun rose, I drove out of the park and never looked back. When I got home, I checked the memory card for my camera. Most of the photos were corrupted, but one image remained clear. It was her face, pale and hollow, with those fiery eyes staring directly into the lens. Now, even in the safety of my apartment, I hear whispers at night. And sometimes, when I glance at the mirror, I see her standing behind me. My name is Callie Morris, and I'm 35 years old. This happened a few weeks ago, and even now, I can't get it out of my head. I've spent years writing about strange places for my travel blog, chasing legends, debunking myths. But Pine Hollow? It was something else entirely, something I can't explain. I had come to the edge of the Cache River State Natural Area in Illinois, after hearing about a secluded spot called Pine Hollow. The locals whispered about ghostly children who wandered the swamps at night, their laughter echoing through the trees. It was perfect fodder for my blog. Haunted Swamps of the Midwest, I could already imagine the headline. When I pulled up in my RV late that afternoon, the place looked exactly as I'd hoped. Wild, untouched, and eerily quiet. The campsite was a patch of dirt surrounded by towering cypress trees. The swamp stretched out behind it, a black mirror under the fading light. A grizzled park ranger named Tom approached as I was unloading my gear. He was in his late 50s with sun-weathered skin and a look that screamed no nonsense. "You're Callie, right?" he asked, glancing at the RV. "The blogger?" "That's me," I said, forcing a smile. "Heard this place has a few spooky stories." Tom frowned. "It's more than stories. You'd do well to stay near your site, ma'am. Don't go wandering into the swamp." "Why?" I asked, genuinely curious. what happens out there?" Tom shifted uncomfortably. "You've heard of the lost children, haven't you? Kids from a settlement that got wiped out by a fever in the 1800s. Some say their spirits never left. People who go looking for them." He trailed off, staring into the woods. "They don't always come back." I almost laughed. "Well, thanks for the warning, but I'll be fine." He looked at me for a long moment before nodding. "Just remember, if you hear laughter, you stay put. Don't follow it." The first night was quiet enough. I made a fire, ate a can of soup, and took some pictures of the swamp under the moonlight. Around midnight, I climbed into the RV and started drafting my blog post. The only sound was the distant chirping of crickets and frogs. Then, just as I was about to call it a night, I heard it. Laughter. It was faint, like the giggle of a child, but it sent a chill straight down my spine. I froze, straining to hear. There it was again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out the window. Nothing but trees and shadows. I told myself it was just the wind. But as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there. The next morning, I woke to find muddy handprints smeared across the RV's windows. Small ones, like a child's. I stared at them, my heart racing. "It's just a prank," I muttered, trying to convince myself. Maybe some local kids had snuck in during the night. That made more sense than anything else. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest. Later that day, I decided to explore a nearby trail. I took my camera, hoping to get some good shots of the swamp. As I wandered, the air grew heavier, the trees closing in like the walls of a tunnel. That's when I saw her. She was sitting on a fallen log, her knees pulled to her chest. A little girl, no older than 10, with pale skin and dark hair. She wore a faded dress that looked like it belonged in a history museum. "Hey there," I called, trying to sound calm. "Are you lost?" She looked up at me, her eyes wide and unblinking. "I can't find my parents," she said softly. My heart ached for her. "What's your name?" I asked. "Abby." "Okay, Abby, I'll help you find your parents. Where did you last see them?" She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I don't remember." I knelt down, trying to reassure her. "It's okay, come with me. My RV's not far. We can call someone for help." Her expression darkened. "No, I can't go there." "Why not?" "They don't like it there." Her words sent a shiver down my spine. "Who's they?" She didn't answer. Instead, she stood up and pointed deeper into the swamp. "You should leave before they come." "Abby, wait." But she turned and vanished into the trees, as if she'd never been there at all. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about Abby. Something about her felt wrong. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she was part of a local reenactment group, or maybe I was just overthinking things. But then the knocking started. It was soft at first, a light tapping on the RV door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. No one was there. I stepped outside, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. That's when I heard it again, the laughter. This time, it was all around me, coming from every direction. The sound made my skin crawl. I turned in circles trying to find the source, but there was nothing but shadows. Then I saw them. Children. Pale, translucent, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. They stood at the edge of the swamp, watching me with eerie stillness. My heart pounded as they began to move closer, their laughter turning into whispers. "Callie, Callie." I stumbled back into the RV and slammed the door. The whispers grew louder, the RV shaking as if something, or someone, was pushing against it. By the time morning came, the children were gone, but the RV's windows were covered in muddy handprints again, and the door handle was scratched as if someone had been trying to claw their way in. I decided to leave. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. But as I started packing, Abby appeared again. "You can't leave," she said, her voice urgent. "Not yet." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice trembling. "What's happening here?" "They're angry," she said. "You shouldn't have come." "Abby, I don't understand." She stepped closer, her face pale and solemn. "If you want to live, you have to cross the water." "What water?" I asked, but she was already walking toward the swamp. I didn't want to follow her, but something told me I didn't have a choice. I grabbed my flashlight and camera and trailed behind her into the trees. The swamp was darker than ever, the air thick with the smell of decay. Abby led me to a narrow path that wound through the water. "Don't look back," she said, "no matter what you hear." I hesitated but nodded. As I walked, I heard them again. The whispers, the laughter. Cold, slimy hands grabbed at my ankles, but I kept moving, forcing myself not to turn around. Finally, I reached the other side. When I looked back, Abby was gone. When I returned to the RV, it was as if nothing had happened. The muddy handprints were gone, the door was intact, and the windows were clean. But I knew better. Something had happened out there, something I couldn't explain. I left Pine Hollow that day and never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear laughter in the distance, and I know they're still watching. My name is Maggie Reed, and I'm 23 years old. This happened 2 months ago, during what was supposed to be a relaxing weekend in Shawnee National Forest, Illinois. I've always been skeptical of ghost stories and urban legends, the kind of person who scoffs at the supernatural. But now, when I close my eyes, I see it, I hear it, and I don't think I'll ever feel safe in the woods again. It started with a simple plan. My older brother Jason, who's 29, invited me, my best friend Lila, and her boyfriend Rob to spend a few days camping in the forest. Jason had been camping since he was a teenager, and I trusted him to keep us all safe. Lila, 24, is a thrill seeker and a self-proclaimed paranormal expert, always eager to dive headfirst into danger. Rob, on the other hand, was new to all of this. At 26, he was more comfortable behind a computer than in the wilderness, but he seemed excited to try something new, and maybe to impress Lila. We piled into Jason's RV early on a Friday morning, stocked with everything we'd need for 3 days off the grid. Food, sleeping bags, flashlights, and Lila's ghost hunting gear. The drive to Shawnee was beautiful, the trees arching over the winding road like a cathedral ceiling. When we arrived at a little-known trailhead, Jason parked the RV in a small clearing. The spot was perfect, quiet, secluded, with a fire pit someone had built long ago. "This is it," Jason said, stepping out of the RV. He stretched and took a deep breath. "Fresh air, no cell service, this is what I'm talking about." Lila immediately unpacked her camera and EMF reader, holding them up like a trophy. Perfect spot to find something creepy. I rolled my eyes. "You've got to stop chasing ghosts, Lila." She smirked. "I'm not chasing them, I'm inviting them." The first sign of trouble was the generator. Jason had checked it before we left, but when he tried to turn it on that evening, it sputtered and died. "Great," Jason muttered, fiddling with the machine. "Guess we're sticking with flashlights in the fire." "It's fine," Lila said, grinning. "Creepy lighting is better for ghost stories anyway." That night, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. Lila's ghost tales were the highlight, as always. She told one about a woman who vanished in this very forest, only to return as a shadow that mimics her victims. I laughed nervously, but something about her story felt too real, too close. After we went to bed, the first eerie sound came. Knock, knock, knock. It was faint, but rhythmic, like someone was rapping on a tree far away. I froze in my sleeping bag, straining to hear. Knock, knock, knock. Woodpecker, Jason mumbled sleepily from the bunk across the RV, but it didn't sound like a woodpecker. The next day, we hiked deeper into the forest. Jason led the way, his machete clearing the occasional branch. Lila kept stopping to take pictures and scan with her EMF reader, which beeped erratically every few minutes. "Lila, that thing's useless," Jason said. "It's never useless," she shot back, but even her confidence seemed to waver. Then we found the deer. It was lying in the middle of the trail, its body twisted unnaturally, as though something had played with it rather than hunted it. Around it were odd symbols made of twigs and stones, arranged with a disturbing precision. "What the hell?" Jason knelt down to inspect it, but quickly pulled back. "Something's off here." "Probably just a prank," Lila said, but her voice wasn't as steady as before. We walked on in silence after that. That afternoon, Jason sent me to collect firewood near the camp. As I wandered, I heard Jason's voice calling my name. "Maggie," he said, his tone calm and familiar. "Come over here." I looked up, squinting into the trees. "Jason?" "Maggie," he called again, closer this time. "Come on." I followed the sound, but when I rounded a tree, there was nothing there. No Jason, no footprints, no sound. When I returned to camp, Jason was sitting by the fire. "Where were you?" he asked. "You were calling me," I said, my voice trembling. "Out there." He shook his head. "I didn't call you, Maggie. I've been here the whole time." That night, everything went wrong. We were sitting around the fire again when Lila's EMF reader started beeping wildly. She held it up, her face alight with excitement and fear. "It's here," she whispered. "What's here?" Rob asked, looking genuinely scared. Before she could answer, the fire flickered, dimming for just a moment. Then we heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. This time it was louder, closer. Jason stood up, his hand instinctively going to his knife. "Everyone get inside the RV." But before we could move, Lila froze, staring into the trees. "Do you see that?" she asked, pointing. We all turned. There, just beyond the firelight, was a figure. It was tall and impossibly thin, with glowing eyes that pierced the darkness. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. And then it spoke in Jason's voice. "Maggie," it said. A sick parody of his tone. "Come here." Jason grabbed my arm and pulled me toward the RV. "Go!" he shouted. Rob and Lila followed, but the creature didn't pursue us. It just stood there, watching. Inside the RV, we argued about what to do. Jason wanted to leave immediately, but Lila insisted we were safe for the night. "It's just messing with us," she said, though her hands were shaking. "It hasn't done anything." Rob was quiet, staring at the floor. "It's my fault," he said suddenly. "I forgot my boots. I slowed us down." "No one cares about your boots, Rob," Lila snapped. "We need to figure out what that thing is." Knock, knock, knock. The RV shook. Something was outside, clawing at the walls, tapping on the windows. Jason grabbed his knife and motioned for us to stay quiet. The noise stopped, but when we opened the door, the creature was gone. In its place was a crude stick effigy, tied together with strands of something that looked disturbingly like human hair. The climax came the next morning. Lila saw the figure again while we were packing to leave. She ran toward it before we could stop her, shouting, I'm not afraid of you. Lila, don't, Jason yelled, but it was too late. She disappeared into the trees. We chased after her, Jason leading the way with his machete. We found her in a small clearing, standing perfectly still. The creature loomed over her, its glowing eyes locked on hers. Lila, I screamed, but she didn't respond. Jason lunged at the creature, slashing at it with his machete. It let out a bone-chilling scream and vanished into the forest. We grabbed Lila and ran back to the RV, but when we arrived, it was overturned, its windows shattered. Rob was gone. All that remained was his boots and another stick effigy. We drove away in Jason's truck, silent and terrified. Lila didn't speak for hours, her face pale and blank. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting to see those glowing eyes in the rearview mirror. When I got home, I thought I'd be safe. But last night I got a voicemail from Rob's number. It was my own voice, distorted and broken, repeating the words, "Come back." I'm never going back to the forest, not ever. My name is Marcus Hayes, and I'm 42 years old. This happened in October of 2021, during what was supposed to be a peaceful solo camping trip at Devil's Bake Oven in southern Illinois. I was there to photograph wildlife and the stunning rock formations along the Mississippi River. What I found instead still haunts me. I arrived at the campsite in the late afternoon. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sandstone cliffs in hues of gold and red. The formations of Devil's Bake Oven were stunning, their jagged edges and weathered faces shaped by centuries of wind and water. My RV was parked at the edge of a gravel lot, just a short hike from the cliffs. As I unpacked my gear, a park ranger named Jake approached, his wide-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his face. "You staying here alone?" he asked, his tone more curious than friendly. "Yeah," I said. "Just me and my camera." Jake frowned. "Stay on the marked trails, and if you hear drumming at night, don't go looking for it." I laughed, thinking he was trying to spook me. Drumming? What, like a local band practicing in the woods? Jake didn't smile. "It's not music you'll want to hear. Just stay close to camp, all right?" I nodded, humoring him. But as he walked away, I could feel the weight of his warning lingering in the air. That first night, I set up my tripod to capture the stars above the cliffs. The Mississippi River shimmered in the distance, and the forest around me was alive with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, rhythmic drumming. It was soft at first, like distant thunder, but it grew louder, resonating through the woods. I froze, my hand hovering over my camera's shutter button. The sound was coming from somewhere near the cliffs. Jasper, my golden retriever, wasn't with me this time, but I instinctively felt like I needed a companion. I stood, shining my flashlight towards the direction of the noise, but the beam illuminated only trees and rocks. "It's just the wind," I muttered, though my heart was racing. The drumming stopped as abruptly as it started. The next morning, I hiked to one of the cliffs I had scoped out earlier. The trail was steep but manageable, winding through the forest and opening up to breathtaking views of the river below. I stopped to photograph a falcon circling overhead when I noticed something odd near the base of a tree. Claw marks. Deep, jagged gouges raked across the bark, as though some massive creature had swiped at it. The spacing was too even, too deliberate to be the work of an animal. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I'd seen bear scratches before, but these were different, almost intentional. Still, I pressed on, dismissing it as a weird coincidence. That evening, I received a call from Rachel, a fellow photographer and close friend. "How's the trip so far?" she asked, her voice crackling slightly over the spotty reception. "It's gorgeous," I said, trying to keep my voice light. But, I don't know, there's something off about this place. Off how? I hesitated. It's probably just my imagination, but I keep hearing weird noises, and I found some claw marks on a tree today that didn't look natural. Rachel laughed nervously. Sounds like you've been watching too many horror movies. Just be careful, okay? I promised I would, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out here. That night, the drumming returned, louder and more insistent than before. I sat in the RV, staring at the window, my camera by my side. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, surrounding the campsite. My fingers itched to grab my flashlight and investigate, but Jake's warning echoed in my mind. Then I saw it. A shadow against the cliffs, tall and horned, standing perfectly still. The firelight flickered, casting strange, twisting shapes that made the figure seem to sway. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed my camera, snapping a few shaky shots. When I looked back through the lens, the shadow was gone. The following day, I checked the photos on my camera. Most of them were blurry, distorted by the low light and my trembling hands. But one image made my stomach drop. It was faint, but unmistakable. A horned silhouette standing on the cliff's edge, its eyes glowing faintly red. I tried to rationalize it, maybe a trick of the light or some optical illusion. But the more I stared at the image, the less sure I became. By the third night, I was determined to capture something definitive. I set up my camera outside, its lens trained on the cliffs. The drumming started right on cue, and this time, I followed it. The trail led me deeper into the woods, the sound growing louder with each step. My flashlight flickered, its beam struggling to pierce the darkness. I stumbled upon a clearing, where an ancient altar made of sandstone stood in the moonlight. Symbols were etched into the surface, matching the scratches I'd seen on the tree. The drumming stopped. Behind me, the air grew heavy, and a deep, resonant voice spoke. "You've come far, Marcus Hayes." I spun around, my flashlight illuminating the figure from my photos. It was no shadow now. The creature stood before me, its horned head tilted slightly, its red eyes burning like embers. What do you want?" I stammered, my voice shaking. It smiled, revealing sharp, gleaming teeth. "I want nothing. But you, Marcus, you want much." I felt a cold dread wash over me. "I don't understand. You crave success, recognition. You want the world to see your work, to marvel at your talent." The devil gestured to the camera hanging from my neck. "I can give you that, for a price." "What price?" The smile widened. "Your life." I bolted, sprinting back toward the RV. The ground cracked and smoldered beneath my feet, the forest alive with whispers and laughter. The devil's voice echoed around me, taunting me, urging me to stop. By the time I reached the RV, my chest was heaving and my legs felt like jelly. I didn't dare look back as I slammed the door shut and turned the key. The engine roared to life and I sped out of the campsite, the sound of drumming fading into the distance. Months later, I finally worked up the courage to review the photos from that night. Most were useless, blurred by my panicked flight. But one image stood out. The devil, standing at the altar, its glowing eyes locked onto the camera. I deleted the photo immediately, but it didn't erase the memory. Now, whenever I step into the woods, I hear faint drumming, a reminder of the bargain I refused. If you ever find yourself near Devil's Bake Oven, remember this: some places are better left unexplored. My name is Claire Reynolds, and I'm 35 years old. This happened last fall, in October of 2022, at Dead Man's Hollow in the Trail of Tears State Forest, Illinois. I went there to clear my head, to find peace in solitude after my divorce. Instead, I found something that still haunts me to this day. The air was crisp and cool when I arrived at Dead Man's Hollow, the early October sun casting a golden glow on the dense forest. My RV sputtered to a halt on a gravel lot near the trailhead, the engine giving a faint hiss as if even it was tired from the drive. "Home, sweet home," I muttered to Jasper, my golden retriever. His tail wagged in response, his enthusiasm never dampened by my sour mood. I had planned this trip to escape everything: my ex-husband, the pitying looks from friends, the constant reminders of what I'd lost. I wanted solitude, and Dead Man's Hollow promised plenty of it. The locals had been skeptical when I mentioned my plans to camp there. "Not many folks go out that way anymore," the woman at the gas station had said, her eyes narrowing. "Not since, the stories." I'd laughed it off. Every small town had its ghost stories, and I wasn't one to scare easily. The first day passed uneventfully. I hiked a few trails, set up camp near the ruins of an old stone cabin, and cooked dinner over a portable stove. Jasper explored the area, occasionally stopping to sniff at the trees or chase after squirrels. By nightfall, the forest seemed to change. The cheerful rustle of leaves became an eerie whisper, the shadows stretching longer than they should have. I chalked it up to nerves, convincing myself I just needed a good night's sleep. The tapping started around midnight. At first, I thought it was Jasper pawing at the RV door, but when I looked, he was curled up on the bed, his ears twitching slightly in his sleep. The tapping continued, faint but deliberate, like fingernails on wood. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing only trees and underbrush. No sign of anything unusual. "Get a grip, Claire," I whispered, lying back down. The next morning, I noticed the markings. They were carved into the bark of several trees around the campsite, strange, jagged symbols that resembled stick figures. Jasper barked at one of the trees, his fur bristling, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I tried to ignore the unease creeping in. After all, they were just markings, probably left by bored hikers. That afternoon, I decided to explore the ruins. The stone foundations of the old cabin were moss-covered and crumbling, but they hinted at a structure that had once been substantial. I wandered through what remained of the fireplace and an overgrown garden, marveling at how nature had reclaimed it all. That's when I found the journal. It was tucked into a hollow in one of the stones, the leather cover brittle with age. Most of the pages were illegible, but a few words stood out. "The witch will not forgive. Shadows take their form. Don't follow the voices." I laughed nervously and shoved the book back where I'd found it. "Superstitious nonsense," I said to Jasper, though my voice wavered. That night, the crying began. It was faint at first, a soft, mournful wail that drifted through the trees. Jasper growled low in his throat, his ears flat against his head. "Probably just an animal," I said aloud, trying to convince myself as much as him. But the sound grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't an animal. It was a woman. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the cold air biting at my skin. The crying seemed to come from deeper in the woods, pulling me toward it. "Hello?" I called. "Is someone there?" The crying stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. "Claire." The voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it was unmistakably mine. I froze, the flashlight trembling in my hand. Jasper barked furiously, lunging toward the sound, but I grabbed his collar and dragged him back inside the RV. My heart pounded as I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. "Just the wind," I muttered, though I didn't believe it. The next morning, I found Jasper gone. The door to the RV was wide open, swinging gently in the breeze. Panic set in as I searched the campsite, calling his name. Hours passed with no sign of him, and I was on the verge of tears when he finally returned. But something was wrong. Ashy symbols were scrawled on his golden fur, the same jagged markings I'd seen on the trees. He seemed unhurt but skittish, refusing to leave my side. I decided then that it was time to leave. The RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and groaned, refusing to turn over. My phone had no signal, and I was miles from the nearest town. I spent the rest of the day trying to repair the engine, but nothing worked. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the forest closing in around me. That night, the witch revealed herself. The air inside the RV grew cold, my breath visible in the dim light. Jasper whimpered, cowering under the table. Then the lights flickered and went out completely. A shadow appeared in the corner of the room, taller and darker than anything I'd ever seen. Its form was vaguely human, but its movements were jerky and unnatural. "Why are you here?" the shadow whispered, its voice echoing as if from a great distance. I didn't mean to disturb anything," I stammered, my back pressed against the wall. The shadow tilted its head as if considering me. "You disrespected my land, my home. I didn't know." It lunged forward, and I screamed. Desperate, I remembered the journal's mention of an artifact. I grabbed a flashlight and bolted from the RV, Jasper at my heels. The forest seemed alive, branches clawing at my clothes as I ran. I found the scorched tree near the ruins and began digging frantically at its base. My fingers scraped against something cold and metallic. The locket. The air around me grew heavier, the shadows pressing closer. Whispered voices filled my ears, taunting and accusing. I placed the locket on the old stone altar near the ruins and stepped back, my chest heaving. The shadows stopped moving. The forest fell silent. "Leave," the witch's voice hissed, faint and fading. At dawn, the RV started as if nothing had been wrong. Jasper and I left without looking back. Even now, months later, I can still hear the whispers sometimes, faint but unmistakable. The witch may have let me leave her land, but I'm not sure she ever truly let me go. If you're ever tempted to visit Dead Man's Hollow, take my advice. Don't. Some curses aren't meant to be broken. My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm 27 years old. This happened in October of 2022 at Cave in Rock State Park, Illinois. If you're reading this, consider it a warning. Some legends are real, and not every trail leads you home. It started as a trip to escape the monotony of life. My girlfriend, Lila, had been pestering me for months about doing something spontaneous. When her friend Maya suggested camping at Cave in Rock, I wasn't thrilled. I preferred controlled environments, ones with reliable electricity and cell service. But Lila loved adventure, and I loved her, so I gave in. Maya brought it up casually during one of our group hangouts. The park's beautiful this time of year, and the cave has this creepy history. Pirates, curses, sounds fun, right? Her voice was tinged with unease, but Lila jumped at the idea. Sam, my best friend, rolled his eyes. Curses? Yeah, sure. Probably just locals trying to scare off tourists. Maya gave him a quiet look, but she didn't argue. We arrived at the park on a chilly Friday evening, our old RV rumbling like it might give out at any moment. The generator had been acting up for weeks, but Sam swore he'd fixed it. He parked us near the edge of the woods, just a short hike from the cave itself. "It's perfect," Lila declared, jumping out of the RV. Her blonde hair caught the dying sunlight, and for a moment, her excitement made me forget how uneasy I felt about the place. The first signs of trouble were small. The generator flickered on and off. forcing us to rely on the campfire for light. Our portable stove wouldn't work, so we ate cold sandwiches. Sam laughed it off, but I could see Maya watching the tree line, her dark eyes scanning the shadows as if waiting for something. That night, I woke to a sound. It was faint at first, just a soft tapping on the RV wall. I sat up, holding my breath, and listened. Tap, tap, tap. "Lila?" I whispered. She stirred beside me, but didn't wake. I crept to the window and peeked out. The forest was a blur of moonlit shapes. Then I heard it. My name. "Ethan." It was Lila's voice, but it came from outside. I froze. My first thought was that she was playing a prank, but I turned and saw her sound asleep. My blood ran cold. The voice called again, this time farther away. "Ethan." I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I told the group what I'd heard. "It was probably a bird or something," Sam said, sipping his coffee. "They can mimic sounds, you know." Lila gave me a teasing smile. "Or maybe it's the cursed pirates calling your name." I didn't laugh. Maya finally spoke, her voice quiet. It wasn't a bird. She looked at me, her expression serious. Whatever it wasn't natural. That afternoon we hiked to the cave. The limestone walls loomed over us, damp and dark, and the air inside was colder than it should have been. Maya hesitated at the entrance. "I'll wait out here," she said, clutching her jacket tightly. Sam rolled his eyes. "Suit yourself." The rest of us ventured inside, our flashlights cutting through the gloom. Strange carvings lined the walls. Symbols I didn't recognize. "Look at this," Lila said, running her fingers over one. "Don't touch it," I snapped. She frowned at me but stepped back. Deeper in the cave, we found what looked like an old campsite. Rusted cans, a decayed blanket, and a small leather-bound book lay scattered across the floor. The book's pages were damp and smudged, but one entry stood out. "The shadows mimic us. Don't trust their voices, don't follow them. I didn't tell the others." That night, things got worse. As we sat around the fire, the forest seemed alive with movement. Shadows danced just beyond the firelight, and every crack of a branch made us jump. "Probably deer," Sam said, but his voice lacked conviction. Around midnight, Lila went to bed, and Sam followed shortly after. Maya and I stayed by the fire. "Do you feel it?" she asked suddenly. "Feel what?" She stared into the flames. "Like we're being watched." I couldn't deny it. Sometime later, I heard footsteps. I turned, expecting Sam or Lila, but the figure approaching was wrong. Its movements were jerky, unnatural. "Maya," I whispered, but she was already staring. The figure stepped into the firelight. It looked like Lila, same hair, same clothes, but its face was wrong. The eyes were too large, the smile too wide. "Maya," it said, its voice distorted. Maya grabbed my arm. "Get inside," she hissed. We ran for the RV, slamming the door behind us. "What the hell was that?" I demanded. Maya shook her head, tears in her eyes. "A warning. We shouldn't have come here." The next day, Lila was different. She was quiet, withdrawn. At first, I thought she was tired, but then she started muttering under her breath, phrases in a language I didn't recognize. Sam noticed too. "She's probably just freaked out," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. I pulled him aside. "We need to leave." "We're not cutting the trip short because you're scared," he snapped. That night, the RV's walls shook violently. Something was outside, growling, scratching. When we opened the door, we found claw marks in the metal. The final straw came when Lila disappeared. I woke to find her gone, the RV door wide open. We searched the forest, calling her name, until we found her by the riverbank. staring blankly at the water. "She's not herself," Maya said. I didn't want to believe it, but deep down, I knew she was right. Maya suggested an offering. She believed the Skinwalker, or whatever it was, wanted us to acknowledge its presence. I remembered the book we'd found in the cave and decided to leave it behind. We placed it at the edge of the woods, along with a circle of salt and burning sage. The forest grew silent. At dawn, we packed up and left. Lila barely spoke, and the rest of us were too shaken to fill the silence. I don't know if we did the right thing, but the attack stopped. Still, I can't shake the feeling that we left a piece of ourselves behind in that cursed place. If you're ever tempted to visit Cave-in Rock, think twice. Some voices aren't meant to be followed. My name is Michael Torres, and I'm 35 years old. This happened last summer during a solo RV trip to Cave-in Rock State Park, Illinois. I'd gone there to shoot survival videos for my YouTube channel, a project I'd started after leaving the military. Things hadn't been going well, and I figured upping the stakes with an overnight adventure in the famous cave would get me more views. I had no idea what I was walking into. The trip started like any other. I parked my RV at a secluded site by the woods, unpacked my gear, and planned my next 3 days of filming. The park was strangely empty for the time of year, but I chalked it up to luck. Fewer distractions meant I could focus. By late afternoon, I'd set up my first video, a tutorial on fire starting with wet wood. The process calmed me, as it always did, and for a while, I forgot about my channel's low subscriber count, my dwindling savings, and the memories I couldn't seem to shake. Memories of my little brother Danny. Danny had drowned when we were kids. I'd been the one who dragged him into the river, sure we could swim across. He didn't make it, and I've been carrying that guilt ever since. But guilt doesn't pay bills, so I buried it as best I could and kept working. The first night, I heard the whistle. It came faintly at first, carried by the wind. A simple, haunting melody that didn't seem to have a source. I assumed it was a bird, or maybe the wind itself playing tricks. But as I lay in bed, trying to ignore it, the sound grew louder, closer. By midnight, I was too unsettled to sleep. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin, but the sound had stopped. The woods were silent. Too silent. The next morning, I walked into town for supplies. It was a tiny, sleepy place, the kind of town where everyone knows everyone. At a general store, I mentioned the whistle to the woman behind the counter. She was older, with sharp eyes and a wary expression. "You heard the whistle?" she asked, her voice low. "Yeah," I said, shrugging it off. "Probably just some local wildlife, right?" Her face darkened. "You don't follow it, you hear me? No matter how sweet it sounds, you don't follow." "What's that supposed to mean?" She leaned closer. "It's the devil's whistle. If you follow it, he'll come for you." That evening, I set out to explore the infamous Cave-in Rock, hoping to shake off her warning. The cave was massive, carved into a limestone bluff overlooking the Ohio River. Its history was steeped in blood. River pirates, thieves, and murderers had used it as a hideout in the 1800s. Local legends claimed their spirits still haunted the cave, but I wasn't interested in ghosts. I wanted to capture its raw, eerie beauty. Inside, the air was cool and damp. My flashlight beam swept over graffiti-covered walls, revealing strange carvings beneath the spray paint. They looked like symbols: circles, stars, jagged lines. I recorded some footage, making a mental note to research them later. As I left the cave, the whistling started again. This time, it wasn't faint. It echoed clearly from the woods, a perfect, lilting melody that seemed to tug at something deep inside me. Against my better judgment, I followed it. The trail led me to a clearing where an old oak tree stood. Beneath it was a figure, a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered clothing. His eyes were black, his skin pale as ash. He smiled when he saw me. "You've come far," he said, his voice smooth and melodic, like the whistle itself. "Who are you?" I demanded, though my legs felt like lead. Something about him made it impossible to look away. "They call me the Whistler," he said, "and I've been waiting for you." I tried to move, but my body wouldn't obey. The Whistler stepped closer, his smile widening. "You carry a heavy burden," he said, his voice dripping with sympathy. "Your brother. You blame yourself." My heart pounded. "How do you know about that?" "I know many things, Michael. I know what you want most in this world, and I can give it to you." His words twisted around me like a snake. "What are you talking about?" "I can bring Danny back," he said, "alive and whole, as if he never left. All I ask is a small price: your soul." The offer hit me like a punch to the gut. Danny alive? The possibility was intoxicating, but the rational part of me screamed to run. I shook my head. "This is insane. You're not real. This isn't real." The Whistler laughed, a sound as hollow as the wind through a graveyard. "If you doubt me, let me show you." He snapped his fingers, and the clearing shifted. Suddenly, I was standing by the river from my childhood. Danny was there, laughing as he splashed in the water. He looked exactly as he had before the accident, bright-eyed, full of life. "See for yourself," the Whistler said. My chest ached with longing, but I knew it wasn't real. "This is a trick." "Is it?" he asked, his tone almost gentle. "Think of all the years you've lost, the birthdays, the moments you'll never get back. I can give them to you." I clenched my fists, forcing myself to look away. "No, I'm not making any deals." The vision shattered, and I was back in the clearing. The Whistler's smile faded, replaced by something darker. "So be it," he said, "but no one walks away for free." The ground trembled, and the air grew icy. Shadowy figures emerged from the woods, their faces featureless, but their forms human. They moved toward me, their limbs jerking unnaturally, as if pulled by invisible strings. I ran. My flashlight flickered as I stumbled through the trees, the sound of the whistle chasing me. When I reached the cave, I darted inside, hoping the thick walls would block the sound. The cave was worse. The walls seemed to close in, the carvings glowing faintly in the darkness. The whistle grew louder, sharper, like it was coming from inside my head. Desperate, I grabbed a rock and started smashing the carvings. The glow dimmed with each strike, and the whistle faltered. The shadowy figures appeared at the cave's entrance, but they hesitated, as if held back by some unseen force. With one final swing, I shattered the largest carving. The glow vanished, and the whistle stopped. The figures dissolved into smoke, and the cave fell silent. I staggered out, exhausted and shaking. The clearing was empty. The Whistler was gone. The next morning, I packed up and left without looking back. As I drove away, I thought I heard a faint whistle on the wind, but I didn't stop to check. Some things are better left unanswered. I uploaded my footage a week later. The video went viral, but the comments weren't about my survival skills. They were about the sound, a faint, eerie whistle that played in the background. Impossible to explain. It haunts me to this day. My name is Lila Mathers, and I'm 32 years old. This happened in late October, just last year, during what was supposed to be a relaxing camping trip to Starved Rock State Park in Illinois. What unfolded there has changed the way I see the world, and I'll never set foot in those woods again. I'd invited my younger brother Jonas, who's 28, and my best friend Renee, also 32, to come along. The plan was simple: spend a long weekend hiking, camping, and reconnecting. I'm a history teacher, and I was especially interested in researching some of the park's darker stories, like the intertribal wars and the tragic massacre that gave Starved Rock its name. Jonas saw the trip as an excuse to escape his office job and enjoy some fresh air, though he made it clear he thought my history project was a waste of time. Renee, the thrill-seeker of our group, was excited for ghost stories and adventure. She'd even brought along a Ouija board as a joke. I laughed it off, but I couldn't shake a feeling of unease as we drove into the park. The RV we rented was old and temperamental. As we pulled into a secluded clearing near French Canyon, the engine sputtered and died. Jonas grumbled as he tried to restart it, but the engine refused to turn over. "Guess we're not going anywhere until tomorrow," Jonas said, slamming the driver's seat in frustration. Renee leaned out the window, grinning. "Good thing I brought marshmallows. Let's make the best of it." That first night started off fine. We built a fire, roasted marshmallows, and I shared the story of the massacre that had happened centuries ago. The tale described how a group of Native Americans, besieged by their enemies, had starved to death atop the rock that now bears its name. Their spirits, according to legend, still wandered the area, seeking vengeance. Jonas rolled his eyes. "Spirits, huh? More like bad luck and superstition. Let's talk about something less depressing." Renee, of course, was enthralled. "What if we find something out here? Like an artifact or—" A rustling sound interrupted her. We all froze, staring into the dark woods beyond the firelight. "It's just an animal," Jonas said, though his voice wasn't as confident as usual. I wasn't so sure. The sound had a deliberate rhythm, like footsteps, but nothing emerged from the trees, and eventually we all went to bed. The first sign that something was wrong came the next morning. Renee found it. A small doll made of twigs and feathers hanging from a tree branch near our campsite. She waved it at me, grinning. "Looks like we've got company." "Put that down," I snapped. The doll gave me the creeps. It looked like a protective talisman, the kind you'd see in old rituals. "Relax," she said, setting it back where she found it. "It's probably just some kid's art project." Jonas laughed. "Yeah, or a souvenir someone left behind. Don't let your imagination run wild." But I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. That afternoon, we hiked to French Canyon. The path was eerily quiet. No birds, no wind, just the crunch of leaves underfoot. "Why's it so dead out here?" Renee asked, her voice breaking the silence. "Probably the time of year," Jonas said, but he sounded uncertain. Halfway to the canyon, I caught a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadowy figure darting between the trees. I stopped, my heart racing. "What is it?" Jonas asked. "I thought I saw someone," I said, pointing. But when we looked, there was nothing there. "Probably a hiker," Renee said, though she looked a little nervous now. We made it to the canyon without further incident, but the oppressive quiet continued to gnaw at me. That night, things escalated. It started with the whispers, faint and distant, like a conversation just out of earshot. I sat up in my sleeping bag, straining to hear, but the whispers stopped. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, then louder. It sounded like it was coming from outside the RV. "Jonas?" I hissed, shaking him awake. "Do you hear that?" He groaned. "It's just the wind, Lila. Go back to sleep." But the knocking grew louder, more insistent. Renee woke up too, and we all sat there listening. Then a voice called out. It was my voice, coming from the darkness outside the RV. "Lila, come here." Jonas grabbed a flashlight and threw open the door, determined to prove it was just our imaginations. He stepped outside, sweeping the beam of light across the clearing. "Nothing's here," he said, but his voice wavered. "Get back inside," I shouted, pulling him back in. Just as the door shut, something slammed against it, hard enough to rattle the RV. Renee screamed, and Jonas locked the door as fast as he could. The whispers returned, louder now, circling the RV. I peeked out the window and saw it. A gaunt, humanoid figure, its limbs too long, its face pale and featureless. It moved unnaturally, like it didn't understand how bodies were supposed to work. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, too terrified to move. By dawn, the whispers and knocking had stopped, but the RV wouldn't start. We were stranded. "We need to leave," I said, "now." "We can't just walk out of here," Jonas said. "It's miles to the main road." "Then we wait," Renee said. "Someone will come by eventually." But no one came, and by midday Renee had wandered off, saying she wanted to explore. When she didn't return after an hour, we went looking for her. We found her at the edge of a cliff, staring out over the canyon. She didn't respond when we called her name. When I grabbed her shoulder, she turned to look at me, her eyes wide and glassy. "They're here," she whispered. "They're always here." "What are you talking about?" Jonas demanded. But Renee didn't answer. She just pointed to the woods where the shadowy figures were gathering. The rest of the day was a blur of panic and desperation. We tried to leave the campsite on foot, but the figures followed us, their whispers growing louder. Jonas tripped and fell into a shallow ravine, twisting his ankle. I had to half carry him back to the RV, where we barricaded ourselves inside. That night, the figures surrounded us again, banging on the walls and windows. They were more aggressive now, clawing at the door, trying to get in. Desperate, I remembered the talisman Renee had found. It was still hanging from the tree. "I think it's a protection charm," I said. "If we put it back, maybe they'll stop." Renee and I ran to the tree, leaving Jonas behind to keep the door shut. The figures swarmed around us, their hollow eyes glowing in the dark. I recited an apology aloud, hoping the spirits would understand. When we placed the talisman back on the branch, the figures stopped. They stood motionless for a moment, then melted into the shadows, leaving us in silence. By morning, the RV's engine miraculously started. We left Starved Rock without looking back. Jonas didn't speak the entire drive home. Renee, on the other hand, became obsessed with what we'd seen, researching everything she could about the park's history and legends. As for me, I quit my research paper and vowed never to return. But sometimes, when I close my eyes at night, I still hear the whispers, and I wonder if the spirits of Starved Rock ever truly let us go. My name is Sarah Grant, and I'm 40 years old. This happened in late May of last year, during what was supposed to be a routine camping trip for work. I'm a travel writer, and my job is to explore lesser-known destinations and write about them. Usually, these trips are peaceful, even therapeutic, but Fox Ridge State Park in Illinois was different. It was where I came face to face with something I still can't explain. I'd been going through a rough patch. Divorce papers finalized, my savings drained from legal fees. I decided to distract myself with work, researching Fox Ridge's lesser-known history of witchcraft trials. The story of Eleanor Ashcroft, an accused witch hanged from an old oak tree in the park, intrigued me. Her spirit was said to haunt the area, cursing anyone who lingered near the tree. It sounded like just the sort of folklore my readers loved. The park was only a few hours from Chicago, so I loaded up my rented RV and set off alone. I'd done solo trips plenty of times, but as the trees of Fox Ridge loomed closer and the cell service bars on my phone dropped to zero, I felt a twinge of unease. I told myself it was just nerves. I was here to do a job, not get spooked by old ghost stories. The first night was uneventful, aside from the RV's electrical issues. The interior lights flickered sporadically and my phone wouldn't charge. I chalked it up to a faulty adapter and went to bed early, planning to hike to the infamous Witch Tree the next morning. By late morning, the sky darkened unexpectedly and a heavy rain rolled in. My boots sank into the mud as I trudged down the trail, camera slung over my shoulder. The path was eerily quiet, the usual hum of forest life absent. I found myself jumping at every snapping twig. As I neared the clearing where the witch tree stood, the air grew noticeably colder. My breath fogged, despite the mild weather forecast. The tree itself was unmistakable, gnarled and massive, its bare branches twisting like skeletal fingers. Around its base were strange carvings in the dirt, symbols I didn't recognize, along with charred piles of wood and small bones. I snapped a photo, but my camera screen glitched, distorting the image. That was when I first heard it. A faint, rhythmic chant carried on the wind. I looked around, but no one was there. Back at the campsite, I met Maggie Cooper, a ranger in her late 50s with sharp eyes and a cautious demeanor. She knocked on the RV door as I was toweling off from the rain. "Folks don't usually camp this close to the witch tree," she said, glancing at the clearing behind my site. "I'd suggest moving closer to the main campground." I forced a laugh. "Why's that? Ghosts don't like company?" Maggie didn't laugh. "People who camp here see things, hear things. I'd move if I were you." Her warning stuck with me, but I was stubborn. I wasn't about to pack up because of local superstition. Later that evening, as the rain tapered off, I heard a knock on the RV door. It wasn't Maggie this time, but a man in his mid-30s with wild eyes and a notebook in hand. "Sorry to bother you," he said. "I'm Ethan Wilkes. I'm a historian. Or, well, an amateur one. Are you here for the witch tree?" I hesitated, unsure whether to invite him in. But my curiosity won out, and I opened the door. Ethan launched into a rapid explanation about Eleanor Ashcroft, claiming he'd been studying her case for years. "She wasn't a witch," he said, flipping through his notes. "She was framed by the townspeople, but they say her spirit turned dark after her death. People who get too close to the tree, they change." I didn't tell Ethan about the chanting or the strange cold, but his stories unnerved me. He begged me to join him on a nighttime investigation, insisting it was the only way to truly understand the curse. Against my better judgment, I agreed. At midnight, we trekked back to the witch tree, flashlights barely piercing the fog that had settled over the park. The carvings I'd seen earlier seemed deeper now, as though someone, or something, had etched them further into the earth. Ethan began muttering to himself, running his fingers over the symbols like he was in a trance. "What are you doing?" I whispered. He didn't respond. His flashlight beam flickered, casting strange shadows across the clearing. Then I saw her. A figure standing beneath the tree, her head tilted unnaturally to one side, a noose around her neck. Her eyes locked onto mine, hollow and burning at the same time. "Do you see her?" I hissed, shaking Ethan, but he didn't answer. Instead, he began carving one of the symbols into his arm with a pocket knife. "Ethan, stop!" I grabbed his wrist, but he was terrifyingly strong. The chanting I'd heard earlier grew louder, though there was no one else around. Panicked, I dragged Ethan back toward the RV. He stumbled and fell, mumbling Eleanor's name over and over. I managed to get him inside and lock the door, but the chanting didn't stop. It surrounded us, echoing in my head. Then the scratching began. Long, deliberate strokes against the RV's walls. The lights flickered wildly, plunging us into darkness before snapping back on. I peeked through the window and saw her again, standing just outside. Her mouth moved as if she were chanting, though the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once. Ethan lunged toward the door, trying to open it. "She's calling me," he said, his voice eerily calm. "I have to go to her." I grabbed a can of pepper spray and aimed it at him. "You're not going anywhere." I realized then that the only way to stop this was to confront it. Maggie's words came back to me. People who camp here see things, hear things. She must have known more than she was letting on. Desperate, I grabbed my camera and flipped through the distorted photos I'd taken earlier. One of them showed an effigy near the base of the tree, partially hidden by roots. "I think I know what she wants," I said, though I wasn't entirely sure. Dragging Ethan along, I ran back to the witch tree. The fog was thicker now, and the air crackled with static. I found the effigy, a crude figure made of twigs and bones, and picked it up. It felt cold, heavier than it should have been. Ethan began to scream, clutching his head as the chanting reached a deafening pitch. I had no idea what I was doing, but I remembered something from my research about burning objects tied to curses. I lit a match and held it to the effigy. As the flames consumed the effigy, the chanting stopped. The fog lifted, and the oppressive cold vanished. Ethan collapsed, unconscious but alive. The figure of Eleanor Ashcroft appeared one last time, her expression shifting from anger to sorrow before she faded into the darkness. I stood there, shaking, unsure if I'd truly ended the curse or just delayed it. The next morning, Maggie found me packing up the RV. She didn't say much, just nodded knowingly as I handed her the effigy's charred remains. "Not many people make it through a night here," she said. "You're lucky." I didn't feel lucky. Driving away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a faint shadow hanging from the tree, swaying gently in the breeze. I haven't been back to Fox Ridge since. Some stories are better left untold. My name is Megan Turner, and I'm 31 years old. I've been traveling solo in my RV for the past 2 years, chasing landscapes and forgotten places to photograph for my online portfolio. This happened last fall in Black Partridge Woods near Metamora, Illinois. It was supposed to be another peaceful adventure, but instead I found myself in a nightmare I still can't shake. The place caught my attention while researching Illinois parks. Black Partridge Woods was a lesser-known area, overshadowed by places like Starved Rock or Mattison. But it had something those parks didn't, a history of eerie legends. Locals called it the Screaming Woods, claiming you could hear ghostly wails at night. That was all it took to intrigue me. I wasn't one to scare easily, and ghost stories made for great blog content. I arrived late in the afternoon. The campground was almost empty, which suited me just fine. I parked my RV in a quiet spot near the tree line, unpacked my gear, and grabbed my camera. The woods stretched out before me like a wall of shadows, the thick canopy muting the sunlight. A light mist clung to the ground, giving everything a dreamlike quality. As I headed down the trail, a man emerged from the trees. He was in his 40s, with a weathered face and a park ranger uniform that looked as worn as he did. He gave me a sharp nod, but didn't smile. "Evening," he said, his voice gruff. "You're camping out here?" "Yeah, just for the night," I replied. "The woods are beautiful." He didn't respond right away, just stared past me toward the trees. "Stay out of the deep trails after dark," he said finally. "People say things in this forest aren't right." I smiled politely, assuming he was trying to scare me off. I'll be careful." "You don't understand," he said, his voice dropping. "If you hear screaming, don't go looking for it." Before I could ask what he meant, he turned and walked away, his figure disappearing into the trees like a ghost. I shook my head and laughed it off. Every park had its quirks, and every ranger had their warnings. By twilight, I had wandered deeper into the woods, chasing the fading light with my camera. The trees loomed taller here, their branches knitting together into a dense canopy. The air felt cooler, heavier. I stopped to photograph a moss-covered log, adjusting the aperture to capture the soft light filtering through the mist. That's when I heard it. A scream, faint but unmistakable, echoed through the trees. It wasn't an animal, it was human, high-pitched and desperate. My first thought was that someone might be hurt, maybe a hiker in trouble. I grabbed my flashlight and followed the sound, my pulse quickening. The trail twisted and narrowed, the mist thickening around me. The scream came again, louder this time, pulling me deeper into the woods. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence that followed was almost worse. I turned to head back when I saw her. A little girl stood in the middle of the trail, maybe 8 years old, with curly brown hair and a pale blue dress. She was barefoot, and her clothes looked oddly old-fashioned, like something out of a black-and-white photograph. "Are you okay?" I asked, kneeling slightly to her level. "I can't find my family," she said, her voice trembling. "Can you help me?" My heart ached for her. She looked so small, so lost. "Of course," I said. "Where did you last see them?" She pointed vaguely down the trail. "That way." "Okay, let's go find them," I said, offering my hand. She didn't take it, just started walking. I followed, keeping my flashlight trained on the ground to avoid tripping. The deeper we went, the more the woods seemed to change. The trees grew gnarled and twisted, their branches clawing at the sky. The air turned colder, and the mist thickened into a heavy fog. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked. She stopped abruptly and turned to face me. Her eyes, which had seemed normal before, now gleamed unnaturally in the light. "Do you like playing games?" she asked, tilting her head. "What?" I said, taken aback. "They like playing games," she said, her voice suddenly lower, almost a growl. A chill ran down my spine. "Who's they?" She didn't answer. Instead, she smiled, a wide, unnatural grin that made my stomach lurch, and turned to walk ahead. I wanted to turn back, but something about her kept me following. It wasn't just concern. It was like I couldn't help myself, like the forest itself was pulling me forward. The trail twisted into a narrow, almost impassable path, and then I saw it. An old, crumbling cabin tucked between the trees. The girl stopped in front of it and pointed. "They're inside," she said. I hesitated. The cabin was dark, its windows broken and its roof sagging. Strange symbols were carved into the wood around the door, circles, spirals, and claw-like shapes. My instincts screamed at me to leave. "I don't think your family's in there," I said, my voice shaky. "They're waiting for you," she said, her smile widening. Before I could respond, she stepped backward into the shadows and vanished. The cabin door creaked open on its own. I shone my flashlight inside, revealing a single room filled with broken furniture and rotting wood. The walls were covered in more of the strange symbols, and the air reeked of decay. On a table in the center of the room sat a pile of old photographs. They showed families, smiling brightly, but their eyes seemed wrong, hollow, lifeless. My stomach turned as I realized some of the faces looked familiar, like the ranger I'd met earlier. I grabbed one of the photos, my hands shaking. A sudden scream pierced the silence, so loud and close it felt like it was coming from inside my skull. I spun around, but there was no one there. I bolted out of the cabin, my flashlight barely cutting through the fog. The screams followed me, echoing through the trees, overlapping and growing louder. Then I saw them. Figures moving through the mist. Their shapes were vague, but their eyes burned like coals. My breath caught as one of them stepped closer. It was the little girl, but her face was no longer human. Her eyes were black pits, and her mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with jagged teeth. "They like playing games," she hissed, her voice distorted and inhuman. I ran. Branches clawed at my arms and legs, and the screams seemed to come from all directions. My flashlight flickered, and for a moment the world plunged into darkness. When the beam returned, I was back at the playground. The swings creaked in the breeze, and the merry-go-round spun on its own. A figure stood by the slide, tall, shrouded, with glowing eyes. It was the Wraith, the thing the ranger must have warned me about. Its presence radiated malice, freezing me in place. "You shouldn't have come here," it rasped, its voice like wind through dead leaves. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The Wraith raised an arm, and the screams rose again, deafening and relentless. My head felt like it would split open. Desperate, I grabbed my camera and fired the flash. The bright light seemed to stun the creature, its form flickering like a glitch in a video. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran as fast as I could, the screams fading behind me. I burst out of the woods just as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. My RV was exactly where I'd left it, but deep claw marks covered its sides, and the windows were fogged with what looked like handprints. I didn't stop to inspect it. I jumped in, started the engine, and drove until the woods were far behind me. When I reviewed my photos later, I found something chilling. In one image of the playground, the little girl stood by the merry-go-round, holding hands with the Wraith. Both of them were staring directly at the camera, their eyes glowing faintly. I deleted the photo and vowed never to return to Black Partridge Woods. But the screams still haunt my dreams, and sometimes when I'm alone at night, I hear faint laughter just outside my window. My name is Alex Carter. I'm 34 years old, a former office drone-turned-survivalist and travel blogger. This happened last fall, during what was supposed to be a routine trip to Rock Cut State Park near Rockford, Illinois. I wasn't looking for anything extraordinary, just a peaceful few days to photograph wildlife and document the park for my website. Instead, I found something I wish I could forget. It started innocently enough. I'd parked my RV in a secluded spot near a forgotten trail called Raven's Hollow. The park was quiet, almost unnaturally so, with only the occasional bird call breaking the silence. The heavy canopy of trees cast deep shadows even during the day, but I didn't mind. It was perfect for the kind of nocturnal photography I had planned. That first evening, as I set up my cameras, I encountered an old man on the trail. He must have been in his 70s, with a wiry frame and piercing eyes. He walked with a cane, though he moved like someone who didn't need it. "You camping out here?" he asked, his tone flat. "Yeah, just for a couple of days," I replied, hoping to catch some good wildlife shots. He shook his head slowly. "Stay out of Raven's Hollow after dark. Don't let the kids find you." I chuckled nervously. "Kids?" He didn't elaborate, just turned and disappeared into the woods. I wrote him off as a local eccentric. Every park has its share of odd characters. That night, I set up a small fire and settled into my RV to review the day's photos. Around midnight, I heard it. A faint, high-pitched laugh, like a child playing. It startled me, but I figured it was just a group of late-night hikers. Still, I stepped outside to check. The forest was still. Too still. The fire had burned down to embers, casting faint flickers of light around the campsite. I scanned the area with my flashlight, but there was no one there. When I checked the trail camera, my stomach tightened. There were blurry images of movement, small figures darting between the trees. The timestamps indicated the photos were taken minutes apart, but they weren't clear enough to make out faces or details. Probably just deer, I muttered to myself, though I wasn't convinced. The next morning, I ventured deeper into the woods. The air felt heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. That's when I found the playground. It was an eerie sight. Rusting swings hanging askew, a merry-go-round frozen in mid-spin, and a slide half buried in overgrown grass. The place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. Something about it set my teeth on edge. "Hello?" The voice startled me. I turned to see a boy standing at the edge of the clearing. He couldn't have been more than 8, with a mop of brown hair and clothes that looked oddly out of place, like something from the 1950s. "Are you lost?" I asked. "I'm looking for my parents," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you last see them?" He pointed deeper into the woods toward a faint trail I hadn't noticed before. I hesitated. The kid seemed harmless, but something about his demeanor didn't sit right with me. Still, I couldn't just leave him. "All right, let's find them," I said, motioning for him to follow. As we walked, the woods grew darker, even though it was midday. The path twisted unnaturally, like it was leading us in circles. I tried to make conversation, but the boy was mostly silent. When he did speak, his words were strange. "Do you like playing games?" he asked at one point. "Sure, I guess," I replied, humoring him. "They like playing, too," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Who's they?" He didn't answer, just smiled in a way that made my skin crawl. We reached a dilapidated cabin in a small clearing. Its windows were broken, and the door hung ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. The boy gestured for me to go inside. "They might be in there," he said. I peered into the cabin. The air was thick with the smell of decay, and the walls were covered in strange symbols scratched into the wood. In one corner, a pile of old photographs and news clippings caught my eye. Most of the photos showed families smiling brightly, but the clippings told a darker story. Mysterious disappearances in Rock Cut State Park. The articles were dated from the 1960s. "Hey, kid," I said, turning around. But he was gone. As I stepped outside, I saw her. A woman, around my age, emerged from the woods looking disoriented and pale. She had a backpack slung over her shoulder and carried a flashlight. "Are you Alex?" she asked, startling me. "How do you know my name?" "I ran into this old man earlier. He said you were camped here. My name's Heather. I'm, looking for a haunted cabin. I think this might be it." "Haunted doesn't even begin to cover it," I muttered. "You shouldn't be out here." Heather seemed unbothered by my warning. "Look, I came here to document the supernatural, not to be scared off by spooky vibes. Did you see anyone else? Like kids?" I told her about the boy, and her expression darkened. "The legends talk about them," she said. "They're spirits, or maybe something worse. They mimic kids to draw people in." Heather and I decided to stick together. As night fell, the woods came alive with eerie sounds. Footsteps circling our camp, faint giggles, and the occasional rustle of leaves that seemed too deliberate to be the wind. My flashlight flickered and Heather's camera kept glitching. Then the boy reappeared. He stood just beyond the firelight, his face half hidden in shadow. "Why did you leave me?" he asked, his voice trembling. Heather grabbed my arm. "That's not a kid," she whispered. The boy stepped closer, and his features began to change. His eyes turned pitch black, and his grin stretched unnaturally wide. "We like playing games," he said, his voice echoing unnaturally. We ran. Heather led the way, her flashlight bouncing wildly in the darkness. The laughter grew louder, joined by other voices, high-pitched and mocking. Figures darted between the trees, their forms flickering like static on an old TV. We stumbled back to the playground. The merry-go-round was spinning again, even though there was no wind. Heather stopped abruptly, staring at the swings. "Do you see that?" she whispered. At first, I saw nothing. Then they appeared. Children, dozens of them, sitting silently on the swings and slide, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "They won't let us leave," Heather said, her voice breaking. Desperate, we followed a faint path that seemed to lead uphill. The voices grew fainter, but I could still feel the weight of their gaze. At the top of the hill, we saw it. My RV, parked just where I'd left it. "Go!" Heather shouted. But as I ran for the RV, I realized she wasn't following. She had stopped halfway up the hill, her face pale and determined. "They won't stop unless someone stays," she said. "Go." Before I could argue, the shadows swarmed her. Her screams pierced the night as I threw myself into the RV and started the engine. I sped out of the park, not daring to look back. Days later, I found Heather's camera in my RV. The footage showed her facing the children, chanting something under her breath. The final frame was of the boy, his grin wide and triumphant. I uploaded my story to my blog, warning others to stay away from Ravens Hollow. A part of me knows the truth. The park isn't done with me, and I'll never escape the shadows of Rock Cut. My name is Margaret Hart, but everyone calls me Maggie. I'm 42 years old, and last October I went on a solo RV trip to Rock Cut State Park in Illinois. I just finalized a messy divorce, and the thought of escaping into nature with nothing but my camera and the trees sounded like exactly what I needed. I was wrong. What I experienced there still haunts me, and even now I can't bring myself to look at the photographs I took during those 5 days. It began innocently enough. I arrived at Rock Cut in the early afternoon, the autumn sun warming the rolling hills and dense forests. I chose a spot in a small, quiet campground on the edge of Cedar Hollow Loop, a less-traveled trail I'd heard about from a few online forums. It was supposed to be stunning in the fall, with fiery leaves and rare wildlife sightings. Perfect for a wildlife photographer like me. The first person I met was Derek Mayhew, a middle-aged park ranger with a kind but weathered face. He spotted me unloading my equipment and walked over, leaning on his truck with a casual but purposeful stance. "Planning on hiking Cedar Hollow?" he asked, glancing at the camera slung around my neck. "Yeah, I heard it's beautiful this time of year." He hesitated, then nodded slowly. "It is, but it's not the most popular trail for a reason. If you're going alone, I'd stick to the main paths. Cedar Hollow has a way of confusing people." "Thanks for the warning," I said, brushing him off with a smile. I dealt with plenty of overprotective men in my life, and I wasn't about to let Derek's vague warnings scare me off. I wish I'd listened. The first day was uneventful. I spent it setting up camp, organizing my gear, and exploring the nearby trails. Cedar Hollow would be my main focus the next day, but for now, I wanted to ease into things. The forest was quiet, almost unnaturally so, but I chalked it up to the off-season. The lack of other campers only added to the peaceful atmosphere I was craving. That night, however, I woke to a strange sound. It was faint at first, like a soft tapping at the edge of my awareness. As I sat up in bed, it grew louder, more rhythmic, tap, 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 It seemed to be coming from outside the RV, near the door. I grabbed my flashlight and peered through the small window. Nothing. Just the empty clearing bathed in moonlight. Still, the tapping continued. I told myself it was probably a branch swaying in the breeze, but when I stepped outside, the air was completely still. The sound had stopped. Uneasy but determined to brush it off, I went back inside and locked the door. The next morning, I headed for Cedar Hollow Loop, excited to finally get some shots of the elusive birds I'd read about. The trail was overgrown but manageable, the canopy above casting dappled shadows on the ground. I'd barely gone a mile when my camera started acting up. The shutter clicked randomly, capturing blurry, unfocused images even when I hadn't pressed the button. I stopped to examine the camera, frustrated, but the moment I did, I heard something. My name. Maggie. It was faint, almost a whisper, carried on the breeze. I froze, scanning the trees. No one was there. Maggie. It came again, this time from deeper in the woods. My first instinct was to call out, but something about the voice stopped me. It wasn't just that it sounded strange. It sounded familiar. Too familiar. Like my own voice. Distorted and stretched. Shaking it off, I continued along the trail, but the unease lingered. The deeper I went, the quieter the forest became. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves faded, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed against my ears like cotton. About 2 miles in, I stumbled upon something unexpected. A clearing with a circle of large stones in the center. At first, I thought it was a fire pit, but as I got closer, I saw that the stones were arranged too deliberately, their surfaces etched with strange, angular symbols. In the center of the circle lay a single bleached white bone. An animal bone, I hoped. But the symbols, they made my skin crawl. I snapped a photo out of habit, but when I checked the screen, the image was distorted. The bone was there, but the rest of the frame was filled with what looked like static, jagged lines slicing across the screen. I didn't linger. The hike back to the RV should have been straightforward, but the trail seemed different somehow. Landmarks I'd passed earlier, the twisted tree, the fallen log, were gone, replaced by unfamiliar terrain. My GPS refused to work, its screen stuck on a loading symbol. Then the sounds began. At first, it was just the crunch of leaves behind me, perfectly synchronized with my steps. I stopped, and so did the noise. When I walked again, it returned, always just out of sight. Maggie. The whisper was back, clearer now, closer. I turned in a slow circle, my heart pounding. The trees were empty, but the voice came again, louder this time. Maggie. And then another sound joined it, a child's laughter, high-pitched and chilling, echoing through the woods. My blood ran cold. There were no children here, no other hikers, just me. I ran. When I finally saw the RV through the trees, relief washed over me. But as I got closer, something stopped me in my tracks. The windows were fogged up, and on the condensation someone had written a single word. Stay. The air around me felt heavy, charged, like a storm was about to break. I spun around, and there it was, the Echo Spirit. It wasn't human. Not entirely. Its form shimmered like heat waves, a humanoid shape made of twisting shadows and light. Its face was featureless, except for a wide, empty mouth which stretched open as it mimicked my voice. Maggie. Maggie. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the emergency flare I kept in my bag. The spirit advanced, its form flickering and shifting, as if it were struggling to maintain its shape. "Leave me alone!" I screamed, lighting the flare and holding it out like a shield. The spirit recoiled, its form rippling as the bright light cut through the shadows. With a final, bone-chilling shriek, It vanished into the forest, leaving me alone in the clearing. I didn't waste time packing. I jumped into the RV and drove away, not caring about the gear I'd left behind. When I reached the nearest ranger station, I told Derek everything. He listened quietly, then nodded as if he'd heard it all before. "Cedar Hollow," he said grimly. "I warned you." I haven't been back to Rock Cut since. The photos I took on that trip are still on my hard drive, but I can't bring myself to open them. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the echoes again. Faint whispers, just outside my apartment window. My name is Lila Morgan. I'm 26 years old, an environmental scientist, and until recently, I thought I was a fairly rational person. What happened during that weekend at Devil's Prophecy Trail changed everything I believed about the world, and about what's truly out there, waiting for us in the dark. This happened last October in Pere Marquette State Park, Illinois. My boyfriend Ryan and I had planned a camping trip with 2 others. Cassidy, my best friend since childhood, and Jake, Ryan's cousin. The park was stunning that time of year, with its fiery red and orange leaves and crisp autumn air. But beneath that beauty lay a strange, heavy silence, like the forest was holding its breath. Ryan suggested the trip because he'd heard about the park's haunted history. Devil's Prophecy Trail was infamous, rumored to be cursed after a native tribe's sacred ground was desecrated by settlers. The trail had been officially closed for years, but Jake had heard of a way around the barricades. The first day was uneventful, apart from Jake's lack of preparation. He showed up with a cheap tent missing its poles and insisted he'd just sleep under the stars. He also forgot the map he promised to bring, brushing it off with a grin. "Who needs maps? We've got GPS," he said, shaking his phone. But once we entered the trail, the GPS signal faltered, and the canopy of trees turned the path into a dim tunnel. Cassidy wasn't thrilled about the whole idea, especially after hearing Ryan regale us with the legends of skinwalkers, humanoid creatures that could mimic voices and appearances to lure their victims. "It's not funny, Ryan," Cassidy snapped when he made eerie noises behind her. "This place doesn't feel right." "You're too superstitious," Ryan said, though even he seemed less confident as the trees grew denser. We set up camp just off the trail, close to a stream. The fire crackled, and for a moment, things felt normal. I worked on documenting rare mosses and fungi for my research, ignoring Jake's antics as he filmed himself around the campsite. That night, Cassidy sat rigid by the fire, staring into the trees. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. "Hear what?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "It's whispering, like voices." Ryan laughed. "It's just the wind." But the forest was too quiet for wind. I strained my ears, and there it was, a faint murmuring, like a dozen people speaking at once, just beyond the firelight. I convinced myself it was nothing. We went to bed, but I didn't sleep well. The air inside the tent felt stifling, and I could have sworn I heard my name whispered outside. The next morning, I went back to work cataloging plants while Ryan and Jake explored. Cassidy stayed with me, clearly unnerved. "I'm serious, Lila. Something's wrong here," she said, her voice trembling. "I can feel it." "I know it's creepy," I admitted, "but there's no such thing as curses." That's when I noticed the moss. It was dead, brown and crumbling despite the dampness of the soil. Nearby, there were strange symbols carved into the tree trunks, resembling crude animal shapes. "Probably teenagers messing around," I said, though my confidence was starting to crack. When the guys returned, Jake was practically bouncing with excitement. He'd found something, a stone circle deep in the woods. "You have to see it," he said. "It's perfect for my next video." Cassidy refused to go. "That's where it started," she said. The curse. I read about it. We shouldn't even be here. Ryan dismissed her fears and dragged me along with Jake. The stone circle was as eerie as Cassidy had warned. Large, flat rocks arranged in a perfect ring. The ground within the circle was barren, as though nothing had grown there for centuries. Jake started filming immediately, his voice dripping with bravado. Here we are, folks, at the legendary Devil's Prophecy Circle. They say if you stay here after dark, the forest will claim you. That night, everything unraveled. It started with Jake disappearing. One moment he was joking around the fire, and the next, he was gone. We heard his voice calling out from the woods, "Hey guys, you've got to see this." Ryan grabbed a flashlight, but Cassidy and I begged him not to go. "He's probably just trying to scare us," Ryan said, annoyed. "But what if it's not him?" Cassidy said, her voice cracking. The three of us ventured into the trees, shouting Jake's name. His voice answered from deeper in the woods, but it sounded off, like it was coming from multiple directions at once. We found his phone lying in the dirt, still recording. There was no sign of him, but when Ryan played the video, my blood ran cold. The footage showed Jake standing by the stone circle, grinning into the camera. Then something moved behind him, a shadowy figure, hunched and impossibly tall, with glowing eyes. The video cut out with a loud crack. "We have to leave," Cassidy said, grabbing my arm. "Now!" "We can't leave Jake," Ryan shouted. But as we argued, the forest came alive with movement. Shadows flickered between the trees and low, guttural sounds echoed around us. My flashlight caught glimpses of them, twisted figures with pale skin, their limbs bent at unnatural angles. Then they spoke, not in their own voices but in ours. "Help me!" they cried, imitating Jake. "Don't leave me!" We ran back to the campsite, but the fire was out, and our gear was shredded. The shadows circled us, their mimicry growing louder and more distorted. Cassidy clutched a necklace she'd worn since childhood, murmuring a prayer. "What are you doing?" Ryan snapped. "Trying to protect us," she shot back. "From what? We don't even know what they are." "They're skinwalkers," she said, "and they're feeding on us, on our fear." Suddenly, one of the creatures lunged at the edge of the firelight. Ryan swung his flashlight, and it recoiled with a hiss. Its face was grotesque, a mockery of human features, stretched and wrong. Cassidy insisted we follow the symbols I'd seen earlier, claiming they were wards meant to lead us out. I didn't have a better plan, so we ran, sticking close together. But the skinwalkers weren't done with us. They whispered in Jake's voice, then Cassidy's, then mine. We reached a cliff overlooking the Illinois River. Trapped, we turned to face the creatures as they emerged from the darkness. They were no longer just shadows. They had taken on our forms, grotesque parodies of us. Cassidy stepped forward, clutching her necklace. She began to chant, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. The creatures hesitated, their movements jerky and uncertain. "Go!" she yelled. "I'll hold them off." "No!" I screamed. But Ryan pulled me toward the cliff's edge. There was a narrow path leading down, and we scrambled to safety as the skinwalkers swarmed Cassidy. Her screams echoed through the forest, followed by a deafening silence. We stumbled out of the woods at dawn, battered and terrified. Park rangers found us but dismissed our story, claiming the trail had been closed for decades and that no one named Cassidy was registered at the park. Later, I checked Jake's social media. His account had uploaded a video, a distorted, looping clip of him at the stone circle, grinning as the shadowy figures loomed behind him. I don't know if it was real or if I'm losing my mind, but I do know this. Devil's Prophecy Trail isn't just cursed, it's a trap, and whatever lurks there doesn't let its prey escape easily. My name is Daniel Hawthorne, and I'm 35 years old. This happened last October when I decided to spend a week camping in a remote part of Illinois called Devil's Prop Forest Preserve. I needed to get away, clear my head, and finally write the book I'd been putting off for years. The forest was supposed to be my quiet sanctuary. Instead, it became the stage for the most horrifying experience of my life. I should have known better. I'd heard the rumors, stories about strange disappearances, inexplicable deaths, and a shadowy cult that supposedly worshipped something ancient and unspeakable in those woods. But as a journalist, I'd learned to separate fact from fiction. Legends don't scare me. Or at least they didn't. I arrived at the campground just before dusk, my RV humming along the dirt road as I searched for a good spot to set up. The place was deserted. Not even a ranger in sight. Just trees stretching endlessly, their branches clawing at the twilight sky. Perfect, I thought. No distractions. The first few hours were uneventful. I cooked dinner on my portable stove, set up my workspace, and typed up some notes about the local legends. I even chuckled at how seriously people seemed to take the tales of Devil's Acre, a cursed forest, a murderous cult. It all felt like cheap Halloween material. But that night, as I lay in bed, I woke to a rhythmic tapping on the roof of the RV. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, but it was insistent. At first, I thought it was just a branch swaying in the wind, but when I stepped outside to check, the trees were dead still. No wind. Nothing. The tapping stopped as soon as I opened the door. Lifting the flashlight, I scanned the area. Shadows danced at the edge of the beam, but there was no one there. I chalked it up to nerves and went back inside, locking the door behind me. The next morning, I woke to find strange marks etched into the dirt around my RV. Concentric circles with jagged lines cutting through them, like some kind of primitive rune. My first thought was kids, some pranksters messing with me. But there were no other campers around, and the forest didn't exactly scream hangout spot for teenagers. I tried to ignore it, burying myself in work, but my laptop had other plans. It crashed, erasing the outline for my book, which I'd spent hours working on. Then the RV's battery started to drain inexplicably, leaving me with no power to charge my devices. Frustrated, I decided to take a break and explore the forest. Maybe some fresh air would help. About a mile into the woods, I found it. A crumbling stone altar, half buried in moss and leaves. The thing reeked of age, its surface carved with more of those strange symbols. Sitting on top was an animal skull, its hollow eye sockets staring back at me. It was unsettling, sure, but also intriguing. This was exactly the kind of atmospheric detail my book needed. As I studied the altar, I felt a sudden chill, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. The forest around me grew eerily quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. That's when I noticed the footprints. They were faint, but unmistakable, leading away from the altar and deeper into the woods. Human footprints. Barefoot. I hesitated, then turned back toward camp. Whatever curiosity I had wasn't worth following those tracks. When I got back, there was someone waiting for me. An old man, hunched and wiry, leaning on a gnarled walking stick. He didn't say a word at first, just stared at me with sharp, almost predatory eyes. "You shouldn't be here," he said finally, his voice a gravelly whisper. "Excuse me," I asked, more annoyed than scared. "This land, it takes what it's owed. Always has." I laughed nervously, trying to brush him off. "Look, I'm just camping, doing some research. I'll be out of here in a few days." The old man shook his head. "You think the land cares about your plans? Leave, before it's too late." And then he was gone, disappearing into the woods as quickly as he'd appeared. That night, the tapping returned. But this time, it wasn't just on the roof, it was on the windows, the walls, even the door. Tap, tap, tap. It surrounded me, relentless. I grabbed a flashlight and peered out the window, but the beam caught only darkness. Then I heard it. A voice. My voice. Dan, come outside. I froze. The voice was soft, distorted, but unmistakably mine. Come outside, it repeated. Closer this time. My heart pounded as I backed away from the window. The lights inside the RV flickered and the air grew heavy, oppressive. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the circle of light cast by my lantern. Tall and gaunt, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the driver's seat, clutching a kitchen knife, waiting for the first light of dawn. The next morning, I found more footprints around the RV. They circled the vehicle, overlapping, as if whoever, or whatever, had been out there had been pacing for hours. I decided to leave. I packed up as quickly as I could, but when I turned the key, the RV wouldn't start. The battery, which should have been fully charged from the backup generator, was completely dead. Panic set in as I realized I was stuck. Then I heard it again. My voice calling from the woods. Dan, you can't leave. I tried to ignore it, but it grew louder, more insistent. And then it wasn't just my voice anymore. It was my ex-wife's, accusing me of failing her. My estranged brothers mocking me for my career choices. A younger version of myself, taunting me for never finishing what I started. The voices clawed at my sanity, dredging up every regret, every failure, every doubt I'd ever buried. Desperate, I turned to the journal I'd taken from the altar earlier that day. It belonged to Old Man Harris. The pages were filled with cryptic warnings and details about the cult that had once inhabited the forest. They worshipped a being, no, a force, that thrived on human despair. The altar, Harris wrote, was both a conduit and a prison. If I destroyed it, maybe I could sever the connection, or maybe I'd unleash something even worse. But I didn't have a choice. Armed with a can of kerosene and a lighter, I made my way back to the altar. The forest seemed alive now, shifting and closing in around me. Shadows darted between the trees, and the voices grew louder, more frantic. When I reached the altar, the entity showed itself. It was a towering figure of shadow, its form shifting and flickering like a dying flame. Its eyes, dozens of them, glowed a sickly yellow, locking onto me. "You can't stop this," it hissed, its voice a cacophony of every fear I'd ever known. I didn't listen. I doused the altar in kerosene and lit the match. Flames roared to life, consuming the ancient stone. The entity screamed, its form writhing as the fire spread. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The forest fell silent. I stumbled back to the RV, exhausted but alive. The engine started this time, and I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, desperate to put as much distance between myself and Devil's Prop as possible. But the nightmare didn't end there. Back in my apartment, I noticed something on the windowsill. Those same concentric symbols, etched faintly into the glass. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear the tapping. Tap, tap, tap. My name is Olivia Reynolds, and I'm 28 years old. This happened last fall when I decided to prove to myself that I didn't need anyone else. Not my ex, not my friends, not anyone. I was going to spend a week alone in the breathtaking wilderness of Shawnee National Forest, specifically in the Garden of the Gods. It was supposed to be empowering. Instead, it became the most harrowing experience of my life. I wasn't entirely alone. My Labrador, Lila, was with me. She was my comfort, my company, and my little protector. She had always been calm and friendly, but out here, her demeanor changed. That should have been my first clue. I had barely parked my RV at the remote campground when Brandon showed up. Brandon Knox, my ex. 30 years old, tall, brooding, and annoyingly practical. He sauntered over with a smug grin, holding a cooler. "You didn't think I'd let you camp out here alone, did you?" he said, not even waiting for an invitation to step inside my RV. I wanted to kick him out right then, but I didn't. Part of me was secretly glad he'd come, even though I'd never admit it. His presence was infuriating, but also familiar. I told myself he could stay one night. Then he'd have to leave. The first night, everything seemed normal, almost peaceful. Brandon grilled burgers, Lila lounged near the fire, and I begrudgingly enjoyed his company. But just after midnight, I woke to a sound. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or distant calls of animals. It was a whistle, sharp and high-pitched, echoing through the trees. "Brandon, wake up," I whispered, shaking his arm. "Huh? What is it?" he mumbled. "Listen." We both held our breaths. The whistle came again, faint but unmistakable. It didn't sound like any bird I'd ever heard. It almost sounded human. "It's probably some idiot hiker," Brandon muttered, pulling the blanket over his head. But Lila was awake now, too. She stood by the door, her tail stiff, her ears pinned back. She let out a low growl that sent chills down my spine. The next morning, I stepped outside and froze. The side of the RV was scratched. Not the light kind you'd get from brushing past branches. These were deep, jagged gashes, like something had clawed at the metal. "Did you do this?" I snapped at Brandon, thinking it was some stupid prank. He frowned. "Why the hell would I do that? Looks like a bear." Bears don't whistle in the middle of the night, I thought, but didn't say. Lila barked at the scratches, pacing nervously. Something about them made my stomach churn. They weren't random. They formed a strange, spiraling pattern. I convinced myself it had to be an animal, though the explanation felt hollow. Brandon dismissed it entirely, and we went about our day. The trails were beautiful, but the forest felt wrong. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. Even Lila, usually so energetic, stuck close to my side. Halfway through the hike, I realized my compass was gone. I'd clipped it to my backpack that morning, but now it was just gone. "Are you sure you brought it?" Brandon asked, his tone more condescending than concerned. "Yes, I'm sure," I snapped. "It was right here." We argued for a bit before giving up and heading back. Only, we couldn't find the way. The trail, which had been so clear before, seemed to twist and loop back on itself. It was as if the forest was playing tricks on us. When we finally stumbled into the campsite, the sun was already setting. That night, the whistling returned. It was louder, closer. Then came the voices. "Olivia!" A voice called from the darkness. It was soft and distorted, almost like my own. My heart pounded. "Brandon, did you hear that?" He sat up, his face pale. "Yeah, I heard it." Then it called again, this time in Brandon's voice. "Liv, come here." We stared at each other, the blood draining from our faces. Lila barked wildly, scratching at the door. Brandon grabbed a flashlight and flung the door open, but there was nothing there. Just the trees, swaying in a wind that hadn't been there a moment ago. "We're leaving tomorrow," Brandon said, his voice trembling. For once, I didn't argue. The next morning, We found footprints circling the RV. They weren't human or animal. They were somewhere in between. Long, spindly toes and deep impressions, like they carried immense weight. Brandon was shaken, but still tried to rationalize. Could be some weirdo out here messing with us. You think a weirdo has feet like that? I shot back. The day passed in tense silence. We packed up, ready to leave at first light. But as night fell, the entity escalated its game. This time it showed itself. It was a coyote. At least that's what it looked like at first. But its movements were wrong, jerky and unnatural, as if it didn't quite know how to move like an animal. Its eyes were too large, glowing faintly in the firelight. Then it stood up, not on 4 legs, on 2. I froze. Lila growled, baring her teeth. Brandon grabbed the fire poker, his hands shaking. The creature tilted its head almost mockingly before retreating into the shadows. "We have to leave. Now," I whispered. "It's too dark," Brandon said. "We'll crash if we try to drive through this forest at night." He was right, but staying felt like a death sentence. I remembered something. A story I'd overheard from a local shopkeeper when I was buying supplies. They'd mentioned spirits in the forest, and how salt and fire could ward them off. "Help me build a bigger fire," I told Brandon, and grabbed the salt from the RV. He didn't question me for once. We circled the campsite with a thick line of salt and stoked the fire until it roared. The creature appeared again, just beyond the circle. It didn't cross the salt, but it circled us. Its glowing eyes locked on mine. It started mimicking us again, calling my name, Brandon's, even Lila's. But the salt held. It stayed outside the circle, pacing like a predator waiting for its chance. We didn't sleep. We sat by the fire, clutching makeshift weapons until the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun rose, we bolted. The RV sputtered to life, and we sped down the dirt road, not daring to look back. When we reached the nearest ranger station, we told them everything. They didn't believe us, of course, but one older ranger gave us a knowing look. "You're lucky you got out," he said. "Most don't." I haven't been camping since. Brandon and I don't talk much, but when we do, we don't bring up the Garden of the Gods. Lila is fine, but she refuses to go near the woods. I still hear the whistling sometimes in my dreams. Or at least, I hope it's just in my dreams.